Navia, has the webinar started?
Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. So, welcome everyone to today's event. Welcome to the Conversations on South Asia series, hosted by faculty in the South Asian Studies Collective here at Dartmouth College. My name is Kirk Gambetta. I am the faculty coordinator for this year's conversation series, as well as a postdoctoral fellow in the Society of Fellows and a lecturer in art history. So we're very excited today to be hosting our first conversation of the year about Arsalan Khan's new book, The Promise of Piety, Islam and the Politics of Moral Order in Pakistan, published recently by Cornell University Press. So before proceeding with today's book conversation, I want to make a few announcements and acknowledgements. I first want to make everyone aware of two more events in the conversation series this fall. On October 15th, we will be hosting a conversation about Amanda Lanzillo's new book, Pious Labor, Islam, Artisanship and Technology in Colonial India. After this, the final event of the fall will be dedicated to a discussion about Douglas Ober's book, Dust on the Throne, The Search for Buddhism in Modern India, and will be held on November 12th. So please put those two dates in your calendar. I would now also like to thank our sponsors for this event, the Department of Asian Societies, Cultures, and Languages, and the Bodas Fund for South Asian Programming at Dartmouth. Thank you as well to our two Bodas student fellows, Navya Bharadwaj and Mritula Sarvanan, for their support with organizing today's conversation. And lastly, thank you especially to Hope Rennie in the Department of Asian Societies, Cultures, and Languages for all of her help with the series. Without these three people, the series would not be possible. So to now proceed with the conversation, we are delighted to have Shenila Khoja-Moolji and Atiya Ahmad joining us as respondents. Faiza Rahman, who is a postdoctoral fellow in the Society of Fellows here at Dartmouth and a lecturer in religious studies, will generously be moderating the session for us. So I would now like to invite Faiza to introduce our speakers and respondents.
All right. Thank you, Kurt. It is my pleasure and honor to introduce our speaker today and also the two discussants. So our speaker today is Arsalan Khan, who is an associate professor in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. His research is situated at the intersection of Islam, ritual, gender, ethics, themes that he explores in the context of Pakistan. His book, which he will be presenting today, is titled The Promise of Piety, Islam and the Politics of Moral Order in Pakistan, published, as Kurt mentioned, by the Cornell University Press in 2024. The book examines how Pakistani Tablighis, who are practitioners of transnational Islamic piety movement called the Tablighi Jamaat, aspire to create a transcendental Islamic community through distinct form of face-to-face preaching known as dawat. And Dr. Khan's next book project, which is also very interesting, for which we'll have to trouble him and invite him again, is titled Islam, Citizenship, and Moral Responsibility in Pakistan's Climate Crisis. And proceeding on, I'm going to introduce our two discussants. Firstly is Professor Shenila Khoja-Moolji, who is the Hamad bin Khalifa Al-Thani Chair of Muslim Societies and an associate professor at Georgetown University. She is an award-winning author and researches about the interplay of gender, race, religion, and power in transnational contexts. She explores this theme particularly in relation to Muslim populations in South Asia and in the North American diaspora. Her latest book, The Impossibility of Muslim Boyhood, published by the University of Minnesota Press in 2024, examines American public culture, arguing that Muslim boyhood has been invented as a threat within an ideology that seeks to predict future terrorism. Super interesting. Following that, we have as our discussant Atiya Ahmad, who is an associate professor of anthropology and international affairs at George Washington University. Her research focuses on the gendered interrelation of contemporary Islamic movements and political economic processes, ones that span the Middle East, South Asia, and Southern Europe. Her first multi-award winning book, which I recommend everyone reads, is titled Everyday Conversions: Islam, Domestic Work, and South Asian Migrant Women in Kuwait. Dr. Atia Ahmed is the recipient of several prestigious international fellowships at the Oxford Center for Islamic Studies, Doha Center for International and Regional Studies, and also at the Stanford Humanities Center. Following this introduction, I will now move to Professor Arsalan Khan and ask him to share his slides and to give us a brief overview of his book, following which we will start to embark on a discussion.
Thank you, Faiza. Thank you to Kurt and Faiza for both organizing this, and to Atia and Shenila for graciously agreeing to comment on the book. For the kind of, I have a PowerPoint. It's basically oh, it's not letting me share it. Just that allows me to kind of keep on track and maybe get through this a bit quicker. For some reason, this is not letting me share the PowerPoint. Someone...
You could quickly email it maybe to either me or Kurt, and we could share it.
It was working.
And Navya, can we check if Arsalan has sharing rights?
Should I email it?
Yes, please email it. Yes.
Okay. And then I guess in the interest of time, I will just sorry, it was working 2 seconds ago here.
I know.
I'll just email it to Navya. Is that fine?
I would email it.
Could you email it to me?
Okay.
Email to Fatah, yeah, please.
All right, just 1 second here. Sorry. I can try to email it to Kurt. Kurt is here. Can I just email it to Kurt?
Sure.
Okay. Sorry about this. I think that...
Kurt, you can share?
I'm just waiting for the file.
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't know what happened to it. Actually, it just kind of crashed, I think, maybe.
No worries.
Sorry about that. Sorry about this.
Hi.
Okay,
I'm sorry, I
did you
never
get it?
had to step away for a second, but
Yes, Navia, Arsalan has lost his ability to share his images.
yeah, I'm trying to fix that. I'm going.
Please do, yes, thank you.
Oh, I think it might be working now. Is that there?
Yep.
Okay. Okay. All right. Sorry about that. Okay. So I wanted to say a little bit about the Tablighi Jamaat. The Tablighi Jamaat was founded in the 1920s by Muhammad Ilyas, an alim or Islamic scholar trained at the Darul Uloom Madrasa in the town of Deoband. The Tablighi Jamaat falls in what we call the broad parameters of Islamic reform movements that emerged in the 19th and 20th century that aim to purify Islamic life of corruptions and accretions, biddat, understood to have developed through long contact with non-Muslims, particularly Hindus, and to sort of revive the original Islam of the Quran and the prophetic tradition. The Tablighi Jamaat is one of the largest and fastest growing Islamic movements in the world with millions of adherents. And this is evidenced by the hundreds of thousands and even millions of attendees to the annual congregations, ijtimas, that happen in major cities across the world, including one near Lahore in Rawalpindi, Pakistan. The central claim of the Tablighi Jamaat is that only their own distinct form of face-to-face dawat, face-to-face preaching. Dawat means invitation. They believe that only this particular form that is modeled on prophetic example can spread Islamic virtue and create an Islamic community. This is important because it sets them up against a whole range of host of other Islamic movements, whether those be political parties, other statist actors, people that participate in what's come to be called market Islam, corporations, NGOs, etc. So Tablighis insist that it's this face-to-face preaching process that is really the key means for the spread of Islamic virtue. My interest in the book was to sort of explore how Islamic ethics and religious ethics more generally intervene in the world and how they might do so in a context of political and economic crisis, for instance, in a fractious country like Pakistan, and especially in a context like Karachi, which is rife with ethnic and sectarian violence. Sort of part of the larger goal was to do a kind of grounded study of religious movements like Tablighis, and try to understand how they approach questions of violence and violent fragmentation. And to wrestle that question away from, as we know, reductive understandings of the relationship between religion and violence, that especially Islam and violence, that have circulated post 9/11, and sort of to think through how violence figures as violence and fragmentation and political conflict figure from the perspective of religious actors themselves, Tablighis in particular. The book is partly inspired generally by the critique of secularism in the work of people like Dalal Asad that looks at sort of how secularism defines and subordinates the category of religion, right? Religion is not just something that exists, but instead it is in the context of secularism that religion comes to be defined as a distinct sphere separate from the secular. And Asad argues, as well known, that in a sense, this is not just that religion gets its own space, but that the secular transforms religion. I wanted to take a slightly different approach. I wanted to understand basically how the boundary of religion and non-religion, deen and dunya, which we'll come to, is kind of constituted by religious practitioners themselves, Tablighis in particular, and how they draw on distinct semiotic and ritual ideologies to define religion. So that the book explores how the sphere of what we call religion in modernity comes to be defined on the basis of the ritual and semiotic ideologies in the Tablighi Jamaat. I wanted to understand the political significance of the deen-dunya distinction that Tablighis draw because it sets Tablighis up against a host of Islamist actors, other types who claim to be establishing an Islamic state. It sets them in an odd relationship to the Islamic State itself in Pakistan, and to understand a kind of bottom-up Islamization that rejects other modes of political activism and even market Islam. So focus on dawat as a kind of space for the constitution of the domain of religion and the materialization of a specific type of ethics. Within the anthropology of Islam, and this is also well known, there are many debates that have been spawned. A lot of people who worked on Islamic piety movements like Sabah Mahmud, famously Sabah Mahmud and Charles Erskine, focused on self-cultivation. They drew on a Foucauldian framework of self-cultivation that, of course, emphasized the way that Islam as a tradition is about embodied practice, and embodied practices are about the cultivation of virtues. This is, of course, true for the Tablighis as well. They're very, very much focused on practice, and they very much believe that through practice, the Tablighi is cultivating virtues. But then there became arose a critique of this literature that came from a camp generally that goes by called Everyday Islam. And many of the critics from the Everyday Islam perspective said that there's a kind of overstating of the emphasis of tradition and not enough analysis of the kind of everyday practices of Muslims and the plurality of Muslim forms of Muslim and Islamic life in Muslim societies. They said that there's too much emphasis on piety and Islamic practice and too little on the many other aspects of Muslim life. A lot of this kind of debate seemed to center around issues of plurality, that is, the plurality of forms of Muslim life, indeterminacy of life. People draw on multiple moral registers. They're not characterized by one dominant frame like piety. Ambivalence in life. People are drawing on these different sources and are tied to different things. And so I tend to agree with that there was a sort of not enough focus on how Islamic pious actors constitute selves and how they interact with other forms of Muslim life. So I've tried to do a little bit more of that in my book. This book kind of takes up how the domain of religion is constituted in ritual practices and how the domain of religion takes institutional shape in the kind of congregational life of the Tablighi Jamaat. So it's really is an effort not just on self-cultivation, but sort of the creation of particular types of social relationships and the institutionalization of what Tablighis understand to be religion, deen. So I focus on what I call pious relationality, a particular mode of kind of relating to each other, and how this delineates the distinction between deen and dunya and serves as the ground upon which Tablighis transform domestic and public life. So that's kind of overall, I think a semiotic approach has a more relational approach, even though the Foucauldian approach was also claimed relational interactions between pietists. I think the semiotic one really foregrounds the relational dynamics of piety. Okay, so I'm just going to go through the chapters. I don't want to spend too much time on any of them. The first section of my book is called The Modernity of Piety. In the first chapter, I outline how British colonial governmentality ended up basically kind of trying to formulate religion and draw a distinction between religion and custom. After the mutiny of 1857, the British instituted a kind of policy of non-intervention in the domain of religion and set about to formalize Islamic law. People like Julius Stevens have worked on this history and the formulation of the Anglo-Mohammedan law, and this really spurs a kind of project of reform. That reform predates, of course, colonialism in some ways, but it takes on a kind of added dimension after 1857. And the ulama emerge in all of this as experts of Islamic law and keepers of public morality. This is historical work that others have done. I would flag Brandon Ingram's book on how the alim becomes a kind of figure of public morality, for those that are interested. My focus in this chapter is really how this public sphere emerges and how kind of the public sphere becomes this site in which various strands of Islam are debated, how to properly constitute deen, what constitutes deen and how to constitute. And this includes not just belief, but modes of mediating a relationship to divine power, and how that is implicated, I guess, in not just the content of religious belief, but the form of practice, modes of circulation, and in the very institutional structure that is considered to be properly religious. It is in this diverse contested field that Tablighis come to define religion as a sort of face-to-face process and as the ground for personal and social transformation. I make an argument in my second chapter on history that Pakistan is kind of organized around a sort of genealogical authority. Genealogy and education come to be the sort of markers of high caste status, Ashrafia status, and how dawat provides a kind of directness, it allows for a direct relationship to God. And so this direct relationship to God, in a sense, negates one's social origins and social place. By returning to the original moment of the prophet, one is able, in a sense, to transcend one's origin. And this is, why I explain why the Tablighi Jamaat is able to draw people from across class, across ethnicity, across caste, because it kind of affords this possibility for directness, a direct relationship to God. The meat of the book is really this: how is directness mediated? This is the central question of the book. I take up in chapters 4 and chapters 5. And again, I'm not going to go through all of the details of the argument, um, but I want to say that the way that I bring in semiotics is I draw on ritual theory, but on also on Persian semiotics. Of course, dawat is modeled on prophetic example. Pars called this a relationship of resemblance. Pars called that type of sign an icon, so iconicity. Tablighi Jamaat is really about the production of iconicity. It produces relations of resemblance to the Prophet. Tablighis our activity of dawat is extremely marked. It's very visible people should be able to identify a tablighi, not only by the beard or by the shalwar being above the ankles, but the way they walk, the way they move. And so I really unpack in this chapter this kind of process of preaching as a marked activity that draws the gaze of others. And unlike in some of the self-cultivation arguments, in this case, it is the public stance that one takes. When one takes the stance of piety, when one compares oneself to the Prophet, when one produces iconicity, one becomes responsible for that activity, the entailments of that sign. And so I argue that the dawat is built on a creed paradigm. It's like a kind of stand and be counted understanding where it is by virtue of the public presence of the tablighi, the publicity of dawat itself, that it draws the gaze of others and then inculcates moral responsibility. Underlying this is this idea of sincerity. If I say to others that they must do it, then I must do it myself. I should be a subject. And so the performance of dawat is extremely important, and through the performance, one cultivates moral responsibility. The Tablighi Jamaat is organized around an institutional hierarchy. I go to great lengths to explain how this institutional hierarchy is created, and the distinction between old companions who have done the 4-month tour and new companions who have not done the 4-month tour, and there's a relationship of a kind of discipleship, as well as discipleship with the elders of the movement. And so I lay out this hierarchy and the way that the process of preaching ends up producing a kind of sacred hierarchy. And then in my chapter 5, I turn to what I call the ethics of hierarchy. This is an awkward term, but really what I mean is how does a tablighi come to inhabit or enact this hierarchy in the minutiae of their relational lives with each other, right? And I argue that the kind of hubris, the central problematic for tablighis is hubris, takabbur, and talk. So a person is supposed to become a pious listener to those with more authority than themselves. Pious listening is also a feature, is an argument in Charles Erskine's famous book. So the tablighi becomes a pious listener, by subordinating themselves to pious others. This requires being able to recognize the authority of others. And one of the things I argue in this chapter is on this section, the citationality of piety, is that unlike in many other movements, the Tablighi Jamaat, anybody can become a Tablighi. And so pious authority is available to everyone. So this becomes a problem because then people get too zealous and too eager to assume authority. And so there has to be some structure to regulate this overreach, this excess desire for authority. And so the ethics of hierarchy is I call it a kind of regulatory framework for the production of authority, insofar as the tablighi is supposed to defer to the authority. A good tablighi is supposed to defer to the authority of those more pious than oneself, and also is not supposed to be too eager to acquire that authority too quickly, to recognize that there's a process. And so it defers also to the future. So the ethics of hierarchy is characterized by a number of virtues: patience, humility, patience. Humility tells you that you should defer to the authority of others. Patience tells you that you cannot become an authority quickly. You have to gradually rise the ranks of the movement. And so I look at citationality. A citation is sort of like putting something in brackets and having a relationship to it, but not an identity. You're not quite there. So you have to learn how to cite the authority of other people, and this slows the process of ascent. This is not just a theological problem. My argument is that this is an organizational problem because people are often too zealous in their desire for religious authority. And so this ethics inculcates in them a kind of effort not to overreach, not to overstep one's boundaries, and thus it manages the potential fissures and fragmentation of the movement. So I say this is really integral to how the Tablighi Jamaat holds together. I know I'm kind of going a little over time, maybe 2 minutes. Is that okay, Faiza? Okay, 2 minutes. Okay, I'm just going to very quickly go through 3 chapters where I look at the politics of the Tablighi Jamaat in Pakistan. Chapter 5 takes up the question of the making of the pious home. The goal of the Tablighi is to congeal and to realize certain faith. But certain faith is not really an individual achievement. It kind of requires not just being in the Tablighi congregation in the mosque, but also to establish a certain type of home where other people sort of support you in your process and other people agree that what you're doing is valuable and so on. And so I look at the process of trying to establish a model Islamic home, and some people are able to do it. There's a wide diversity of Tablighis and their commitment to dawat. And so I look at the way that people try to establish this home. Now, the goal, the ideal Tablighi is one who can act in the path of God in a way without even thinking. And this requires that at least you have one generation, or not, if not multiple generations of people in your family who agree with and are committed to the project. And so, but not everyone is able to do that. So I say sometimes there's a disjuncture between the home and the mosque. Some Tablighis are able to realize piety in the mosque, but they come home and they have conflicts with their families and they're not accepting. And so this creates a kind of, I say, doubt. Doubt has a structure. The inability to link the home and the mosque creates a kind of uncertainty about one's faith. And I look in this chapter and I examine how this habitus of certain faith, when it's not realized, there's ways in which the ethics of hierarchy regulates and manages it. It valorizes the individual striving of the Tablighi. Says, okay, even if your brother is not a Tablighi right now, or your father does not like Tablighi, maybe in the future. So it kind of defers the realization of this certain faith to the future. And so it manages the potential crises that emerge. I also look at issues like hierarchical care, and the constitutes is a big theme that I've written an article about as well, about masculinity, and it cultivates a form of soft masculinity that allows the Tablighi to sort of kind of accept certain modes of difference, both in his house and externally. Chapter 6 basically takes up Pakistan's political crisis. It looks at Islamic governmentality and the way that Islamism as a state ideology has been incapable of managing or containing the ruptured forces, ethnic and sectarian, and has facilitated the creation of a certain kind of fraught and conflicted public space. And I look at how pious authority developed in the Tablighis see politics as the worship of the self, as surplus agency, and they contrast piety and dawat to politics. And I look at how they try to institutionalize a sort of sovereign intervention and processes of mediation, sulha, and this is not very common because one should have a certain kind of authority to do it. But I did find cases where the Tablighi becomes a sort of agent of intervention in both domestic conflict and conflicts in the community. And I argue basically that Islamization, state Islamization in Pakistan has been paradoxical, and that it has generated as much of the kind of crises that it claims to resolve, and Islamic authority in the Tablighi Jamaat is a kind of contrast to that. I'm going to wrap up right now because I've gone way over time. So I'm just going to say in the end, my final chapter looks at blasphemy politics and how blasphemy politics depends on the kind of sacralization of the state and the law, And Tablighis don't sacralize the state and the law in the same way, and they see blasphemy, while they see blasphemy as a moral injury, they don't zealously pursue the blasphemy politics that we see in other Islamic groups, the TLP, of course, which is Brailvi, but also among many Deobandi groups. And the reason they don't is because they see the reproduction of the conditions for dawat as more vital than the kind of attack on the blasphemer. Okay, and so I basically make an argument that we need to unpack the specificity of religious practice rather than see some fundamental connection between religion and violence, and instead we need to unpack the ethics of the religious practice itself, in this case, dawat. Okay. And in the conclusion, I say, Pakistan is a sphere of multiple competing forms of transcendence. How transcendence is materialized in ritual practice is a really important thing that we should all examine, and how these kinds of different forms of sovereign transcendence compete with each other. So I'm not going to get into all the details of that, and I will pause. I'm sorry, I went a little over time, so I'll stop here.
Well, no, all good. Thank you so much, Arsalan. That was a very precise summary, and it touched over all the arguments of the book. So it was both precise and comprehensive, so thanks for that. I will turn to Professor Shenila Khoja-Moolji for her comments.
Okay, thank you, Faiza. I want to begin by expressing my gratitude to Dr. Kurt Gambetta and Faiza Rahman for inviting me to discuss this remarkable book, The Promise of Piety. I would also like to thank Dr. Arsalan Khan for the immense effort that goes into writing an ethnography. As many in the audience know, stereotypes about the Tablighi Jamaat are widespread. By providing us with this intimate study, Khan not only dispels these stereotypes, but also invites us to engage with the Jamaat's world on their own terms. This approach uncovers alternate moral frameworks and ways of being that exist alongside liberal and secular traditions, revealing the profound intimacies of these ontologies. Khan argues that the Islamic pietists featured in this book are not radically other. Rather, they suggest the possibility of an interchangeability of moral perspective. Their truths share the same reality as those found in liberal and secular traditions, making them both intimate and repugnant. Through this lens, we observe how this group's ethical positions and moral possibilities compete with other perspectives that shape social and political life in Pakistan. The scope of the book, as you just saw, is expansive. Khan examines the influence of the British Empire, reformist impulses, and the aspiration to emulate the prophetic model in shaping the group's understanding of deen. What I found most valuable were the detailed descriptions of how individuals embody their religious obligations in everyday life and within congregation. This allows us to see piety as an ongoing endeavor filled with ambivalence, ambiguity, trials, and triumph. Importantly, we understand piety not only as a project of self-cultivation, but also as relational, a point that I also explore in my own work, focusing on the practices of care, khidma, and seva among Shia Ismaili Muslim women. Piety is intersubjective. It manifests in people's actions toward one another, revealing the interpersonal dimensions of faith. Another significant contribution of the book is its exploration of the ethics of hierarchy within congregational life. While hierarchies are often viewed as oppressive and at odds with modern sensibilities, Khan encourages us to consider them as a different mode of social organization that does not always take on oppressive characteristics. This perspective allows us to appreciate the social value of hierarchies in the Tablighis' efforts to reproduce congregational life and cultivate personal piety. For all these reasons and more, the book's methodology and the approach to study of Islam resonated with me very deeply. So for my discussion, I'm posing questions that come less from a position of suspicion or critique, the usual scholarly hermeneutics, and more from my interest in actually hearing Arsalan more about the areas that I found particularly thought-provoking. So I have three questions. The first two have to do with gender. I was intrigued by the discussion about women's exclusion from the performance of dawat. Even in women's-only settings, men are invited to deliver the bayan or sermons. This presents a contradiction. While the movement regards dawat as the mother of all practices, a vital amal through which iman is realized and God's mercy is invited, it effectively excludes women from fully realizing their iman. How do then the Tablighis conceptualize women's spiritual potential? How are women supposed to form the connection or jord that you write about, which is so crucial for achieving piety? I ask this question because in the Shia Jamaat that I study, women can perform public dawah and address mixed gender congregations. Their participation is seen as essential for both personal and communal piety. Therefore, I come from a perspective where excluding women from a pious act would be frowned upon, especially considering the progress women have made over the last century. And so I'm curious about the intersection of gender and spiritual potential within the Tablighi movement during the same historical time period. Second, I found the discussion on gendered labor particularly compelling, especially how men in the Jamaat take on traditionally feminized tasks like cooking and cleaning while engaging in dawat while they're traveling. I'd love to know more about how this impacts the valuation of those tasks. Does men's participation in these roles create a precedent for shared responsibilities when they return to their local congregations or homes? In other words, does this practice open up possibilities for defeminizing these tasks? Or does the context of dawat inhibit any re-evaluation of reproductive labor within the community? Lastly, I want to explore the topic of positionality and research ethics. In my recent book, I discussed how I navigated my insider position as a Shia Ismaili Muslim, studying Shia Ismaili women's practices of care and piety. So I'm intrigued and to hear more about your experience as an outsider conducting intimate research with the Tablighis. Specifically, you hint at the social class differences between yourself and your interlocutors, that Talha or even Hazrat may have perhaps brought you into the fold, expecting that you might join dawat. Your status as professor likely make you a desirable participant. So can you reflect on those expectations and how you navigated them? You mentioned some Tablighis viewed you as an agent of disruption. We learned about that awkward conversation with Yusuf Bhai, and your own reflections on Shahzeb's transformation, which had a different arc than yours. So we get all of these fascinating details in the book, and I'd love to hear more about your current relationship with your interlocutors. Have you continued participating in the movement? If not, how have they reacted? I'm just curious about the afterlives of research. In sum, I want to congratulate Dr. Khan for this wonderful book. It's such an engaging read that I could not put it down. Thank you and congratulations.
Thank you, Shenila. Should I then respond to
Yes,
these
you can.
first?
You can. Yes.
Okay. Okay. Well, thank you so much for those very generous, very kind comments, and very generative comments. And I'm particularly happy to speak about. I'm glad to hear about the response to the gender parts of it, because gender is a kind of major theme. I'll just preface this by saying, because the Tablighi Jamaat is so conservative and patriarchal, and that gender segregation is parda is so strongly enforced, it was very difficult to get enough access to women's spaces. Though I understand there are others who are doing research on Tablighi women and their roles and the active roles that Tablighi women have. Tablighi women tend to do the dawat within the neighborhood, right? So they don't go to the mosque, or they don't go do the tours, but they do the so there's this, they reproduce the domestic role basically, even in traveling tours. So the masturat tours in which women will accompany their fathers, husbands, brothers, they will then embed themselves in a local Jamaat, and then they will use the house. So even when they're traveling, the house is the site upon which the women's Dawat efforts are. But I think there's, I found this movement interesting in part because people have done so much research on other movements like Al-Huda, which are very, very centered on women and women's roles. I would say that Tablighi Jamaat is even more so than these others, male-centric, and the transcendent practice of dawat that is available to men, if that is indeed the premise that this is the means of the connection to the divine, then it does produce and reproduce a kind of sacred hierarchical relationship between the genders, so patriarchal relationships. And so yeah, the women that I did end up talking to, often in the presence of their husbands, but also a few who I knew through family connections, separately from the men I was studying, they said what we find in a lot of the literature on piety, that they believed in the reform potential and the power of the dawah to transform the men in a way that made those men, and that the naked power of patriarchy or something, men who were not pious and not performing their Islamic duties, were still in control, but they had a more naked, more ruthless form of power, whereas the pious men of the Tablighi Jamaat had a softness about them. So they reproduced that ideology mostly, but women do end up taking a subordinate role in this system, and do not perform the afzal practice, the highest form of practice, and so that reproduces those gender relationships. I don't think that the Tablighis ever say that women are, of course, that there's a limit to the spiritual realization. That's where the contradiction I think Shenila was pointing to, right? They don't say that. They won't say that a woman cannot be as pious as a man. But the way in which the in-out mosque home hierarchy is set up, it does, in fact, in a sense, produce it does suggest the women's spiritual realization, pious realization, it has some limits that men's spiritual realization does not have. So I don't know if that fully answers your question, but that is something in this movement that I think I did speak to many. Well, what do you think? Oh no, women can be more pious than men. On that level, on the sort of discursive level, that was constantly said to me. Of course, there's no reason to believe that a man can be, but if you think about the way that the practice itself is sacralized, then it has within it a limit to that.
Thank you.
Does men's participation in khidmat? So I describe the men in the traveling tours, they do labor in the mosque that is feminine labor, coded feminine, khidmat labor that they would not normally perform at home. And that performance of that labor, I argue, inculcates in them humility and pious fear and those virtues. That labor that is already gendered and associated with women, and they see this as one of the sources for the production of soft masculinity. I think there's no way fully to answer that, because it's I'm sure that some do. I mean, when you learn how to cook and you do cook, you go home, it's like for us, cooking is sometimes enjoyable. So do they do that reproductive labor? Probably. I wouldn't say that the people that I knew took that labor on as a primary identity or a primary form of work. They understood that the responsibility of that labor falls on women, though like with other things, they could help out in the responsibility. So it's hard for me to gauge how much of that reproductive labor in the domestic sphere came to be allocated to men. Again, and in different contexts in the United States, for instance, where reproductive labor is just generally distributed differently. So Tablighis in the US are probably more likely to be cooking at home, or Tablighis in other settings, maybe at the who knows, in other places in the Gulf, for instance. In Pakistan, my experience is not really, not really. And if it is, it's it's on their own terms. It's not that it actually fundamentally disrupts the distribution of reproductive labor, I would say. So but I think the softness, I get this question a lot. Oh, are they really soft? I can't know that for sure, but I do feel that their openness to that work in the home and their recognition of the value of what the women do at home is very much something they speak about a lot.
All right.
Positionality in research, in my research, is a big theme of my book. I was a novice, and I was the focus of the dawat activity, and I was incorporated into the movement in a sense as somebody who they had hopes in. As I document in the book at length, I had a personal friendship that brought me into the movement, that connected me with a Tablighi Buzurg Hazrat. And the network that I worked in and the people that spoke to me because Hazrat, who was my friend Talha's kind of father in a sense, spiritual father, his sheikh, he gave a certain kind of cover to me, and so they were almost forced to have me around, and I was a source of suspicion also, because what I say in that chapter on the ascent of the hierarchy and the ethics of hierarchy is that I was violating the codes, right? I had reached into the inner sanctum of a Hazrat or of a Buzurg too quickly when I had done nothing to achieve that. And so I was an odd figure who was, in a sense, seen by many as disrupting the proper lines of the hierarchical structure. And so, but they could not also reject me entirely, and some took a liking to me as well. And so I spent a lot of time talking about the contrast and between research and the ethics of research and the ethics of dawat. I mean, that contrast was constant because I was trying to do research and they were trying to wean me away from that research and get me to focus on the practice itself. And one of the assumptions of my research is egalitarian. We go out and we find people that fit in a category, tabligh, and we say, these people are all representative of that category, and we can go and speak to each of them, and they can speak for themselves about themselves. And so there's a certain assumption of egalitarianism, but tablighis would just say, you could go and talk to the people who know, speak to the buzurg, speak to this bhai or that bhai, who are seen as authoritative figures. So their sense of speaking had to be regulated by their relationship to authority. And their sense of me was that I embodied the problem of talk, of excess. I was going to write a book about the Tablighi Jamaat, having never even done the 4 months. So how could I even possibly conceive of writing this thing and circulating these ideas when I had not actually properly embodied the piety that is the condition for knowledge? So I basically, I was a disruptive figure in this and an awkward figure. And unlike many other people who come in and out, because there are many people who aren't committed, I was a constant presence, despite not being a good tablighi. So I managed that, and I managed relationships. My relationships soured a bit, I would say a little bit. And as I mentioned, one of the tablighis who brought me in is a very close, dear friend of mine, old friend of mine. But research did produce some strains and some tensions, and I also said some things or wrote some things publicly that I kind of regret saying and writing during COVID, when the Tablighi Jamaat was coming under intense scrutiny in India. I didn't even know how much scrutiny, and there was a massive Islamophobic attack on the Tablighi Jamaat in India. And at that time, Tablighis during the pandemic, were hosting or not hosting, depending on whose version one accepts, some of their congregations, some of their ijtima and whatnot. And I think I was invited on TRT, the Turkish channel, to speak about the Tablighi Jamaat because they were in the news a lot as a potential vehicle for mass spread of COVID. And I think I didn't speak carefully enough, actually, in retrospect. And that video ended up circulating quite a bit. Like got many, and the Hindutvadis had picked up on it also, and so it circulated and got some million views or something. And I received texts about it that, why did you say these things, like, and at that same time there was just this massive crackdown on the Tablighi Jamaat. So I have these regrets that you never know when the political situation is going to turn in ways. And so relationships are there. I'm still connected to some of them. I don't see them a lot. My friend Talha moved to California, and so I'm meaning to message him and send him the book, but I haven't done that. So, mix. We're still connected on social media, and they still reach out to me once in a while, and one of them wanted to chat about the book and stuff. So,
thank you. Thank you for sharing all that and for being so vulnerable about it.
One thing I will say is that the people I was closest to were also the people who were more in my class. So I didn't really have a class. Many of them were actually richer than me. And some of Hazrat's followers were poor. And so I followed them. I reached out to them and I connected with them. So I managed to get a diverse pool a lot in the class, but I certainly would say that the people more proximate to me were the ones closer in class and stuff. So
all right. Thank you. Thank you for that comprehensive response. I would like to remind the attendees that they are welcome to share their questions in the Q&A chat. We'll be monitoring that chat and posing the questions to Arsalan from there. And I will now turn to our next discussant, who is Atiya Ahmed. And Atiya, go for it. Thank you. So first and foremost, thank you to the organizers, Professors Gambetta and Rahman, and Ms. Bharadwaj and Ms. Saravanan, and anyone else involved in making today's event possible. Professor Khan, congratulations on the publication of your book. What I'll characterize at the outset as a ranging and robust examination of the Tablighi Jamaat through ethnographic research mostly conducted in Karachi, Pakistan. I'm honored and excited to be part of this conversation. Now, to help orient folks to my comments, a few very preliminary remarks. My own work, focusing on contemporary Islamic movements, is necessarily interregional and interdisciplinary in scope. Today, however, I'll foreground anthropology, specifically sociocultural examinations of religion in Islam and Muslim practice, in my comments. Now, an awkward feature of sociocultural anthropological knowledge production is that we work intensively in different field sites, developing insights in relation to our field site interlocutors. But then we often have specific, or dare I say, delimited sets of debates or conceptual frameworks, a situation all too often approached agonistically, that we have to put into conversation with findings from our field research. An either-or logic often holds in this context. You are situated in this conceptual theoretical camp or that one. You are situated in this scholarly lineage or that one. And with respect to scholarly lineages, there's often a logic of accretion and or advancement. What I found most striking in Professor Khan's examination of the Tablighi Jamaat is how ranging it is in terms of the conceptual theoretical camps and scholarly lineages and engages. We have well-established historical works focusing on Muslim South Asia, notably Metcalfe, Gilmartin, Lelyveld, and Eaton's works. We also have a tangled lineage of what I'll gloss as structural and symbolic approaches to the anthropological study of religion, notably here the work of Rappaport and Lambeck. We also have Talal Asad's works, though perhaps less his conceptualization of discursive tradition, something I'll return to later, and the works of folks who hew closely to his works. So here I'm thinking of, and you've mentioned them, Mahmoud, Hirschkind, Fernando, Fadl, Agrama. And finally, we have folks who critique
what they argue to be the aporia of these latter works, so Schilke's emphasis on ambivalence and Mittermeier's emphasis on on the extra-subjective, including dreams and God. All of these works are brought to bear. We can think of them as a ranging toolkit on Professor Khan's analysis of the Tablighi Jamaat. Now, this ranging analysis is effective as it underscores and helps us to appreciate particular features of the Tablighi Jamaat that are often dismissed and or conceptually elided. Before the publication of this book, perhaps the most prominent work focusing on the Tablighis to date is Barbara Metcalfe's work, where, as mentioned in the book, she characterizes the group as pietist and quietist. Professor Khan's robust analysis pushes us to reconsider both the pietist and the quietist, the pietist roughly in the first half of the book, the quietist roughly in the second half of the book. In my remarks, due to time, I will limit my focus to the issue of the pietist, in particular, Professor Khan's analysis of the Tablighi ritual practice of dawah and his arguments that the Tablighi ritual practice of dawah pushes us to consider the sociality of piety, that piety's cultivation needs to be understood in relation to social milieu rather than individuated ones. And also key to Professor Khan's discussion of the pietist is his underscoring of the importance of deference and authority, what he refers to as the ethics of hierarchy to this process. So as we have learned, dawah is understood by the Tablighis to be of primary importance. It is the site and means that mediates the direct relationships between Tablighis and God, where Tablighis do so through their attempts and aspirations of enacting, embodying, and emulating the way and the traditions of the Prophet, peace be upon him. At one point, dawah is described as a walking madrasa, right? Where learning is not limited to the realm of the just mental, the cognition, or the realm of understanding, but is experiential and social. Dawah is necessarily undertaken in person in face-to-face encounters and groups. These groups are, as we've just discussed, homosocial, only undertaken by cisgendered men away from families and workplaces. And practices must be visible and legible. It marks a public commitment or attestation that is necessary to the sedimenting of piety. Dawah takes place at a formalized rhythm, at set temporal and spatial registers and scales. And it is a necessarily hierarchical process and system where, as part of their seeking, it is incumbent upon acolytes and aspiring tablighis to show deference to elders who have a more authoritative claim on proper practice in their enaction and embodying of the way of the Prophet. It is possible for tablighis to potentially ascend this hierarchy through their continued and sedimented practice. And this hierarchical process and system ensures that the way of the Prophet, understood as a set transcendent form to be transmitted without change, adulteration, or innovation, an understanding that is comparable to how the majority of Muslims conceive and approach the Quran as divine revelation that is unadulterated. Okay, so Professor Khan's analysis is robust here in pushing us to reconsider our understanding of piety. And in so doing, he carves out two conceptual tools that are important interventions, right? The importance of recognizing the relational/social nature of pious practice and what he refers to as the ethics of hierarchy. Now, Professor Khan argues that this pushes against and perhaps past existing scholarship focusing on piety that arguably emphasize subjectivity and individual practice in their analysis, and that this work on the Tablighi Jamaat provides us with an alternative means of evaluating and valuing hierarchical practice and systems, right? Pushing against liberal assumptions and understandings. Now, notwithstanding this, I want to push back against how the book positions your analysis in relation to existing works on Islamic piety. I would like to argue that your intervention here, valuable as it is, and let me underscore, that you provide us with important contributions that I think stand on their own merits in helping us to understand the Tablighi Jamaat and in our overall analysis of religious phenomena and piety, but that it doesn't necessarily constitute a critique in relation to existing scholarship. I would say rather that it intervenes by complementing rather than critiquing existing scholarship. It strikes me that in what I have described as your ranging conceptual approach, you bring into conversation works that have fundamentally different conceptual premises. I'll briefly mention three here. In your discussion of dawah as a form of ritual ideology, the Islamic ideal is conceptualized by the Tablighis more as a Platonic ideal, unitary, transcendent, where the focus among Tablighis is on accurate replication of this form and ensuring there is no change or innovation or bid'ah. This differs fundamentally from conceiving of Islam as discursive tradition, where proper Islamic practice is continually aspired to, and where the ideal is not conceptualized as transcendent but immanent to practice, and where, as I have written in my own work, it is not an ontology of being but of becoming. Second, in your discussion of pious practice among Tablighis, you describe and analyze the iterative quality as sedimentation, and perhaps akin to disciplining, and aspirational to a form. This is fundamentally different from cultivation and aspiration to apt practice and precepts. Third, in your discussion of Tablighis enactment and embodiment of the Islamic ideal, it appears more akin to orthopraxy, and this is different, fundamentally different, from embodiment connected to the ethical formation of the self, where, with at least Aristotelian and Foucauldian traditions, the precepts or forms being aspired to are not unitary or transcendent. Now, I don't see these disjunctures as a problem per se, right, or a limitation or a lack, but rather a function of what I referred to at the outset of my remarks is the awkwardness of anthropological knowledge production today, where we scholars engage rich and capacious worlds that are often shoehorned into and then we are often shoehorned into articulating these worlds into more narrowed concepts and debates. I deeply appreciate and applaud your ranging approach within this context, right? The book is, as I mentioned at the outset, a rich and robust examination of the Tablighis, where you provide a compelling analysis that stands on its own merits. And this analysis, in my estimation, complements rather than critiques or supersedes existing scholarship. So now, in addition to this, right, to these remarks, I also wanted to flag a few issues, some of which we've already covered, that I'm curious about, and if time permits, that I would love to hear, you talk more about and/or potentially engage us in discussion about. So one, and I think this touches on a question posed by Professor Khoja-Moolji, pertains to what you referred to as cultural intimacy, right? Your discussion of cultural intimacy that characterizes your fieldwork. I would invite you to discuss this a bit more and more insight about the process of your fieldwork more generally. I see this as pushing back against framing anthropological research in terms of outsider, insider, or the native insider or native anthropologist. And I would be curious, to hear you say more about cultural intimacy. Second, competition. In the book, you characterize the multiplicity of forms of Islamic practice and movements that have developed in and through colonial modernity in terms of competition. And I would invite you to talk more about that. What are the implications of conceptualizing it as competition as opposed to perhaps interrelational, intersectional? I don't know. Are there other frameworks that we can think about multiplicity? The gendered natures of the Tablighi sort of conception of piety and practice. You've already touched on that. Maybe I can just ask, just to kind of add on to this, how would they approach or engage something like Behishti Zever by Tanvi, given the Deobandi connections of this movement and the significance of that work, especially to reformist movements, and thinking about the gendered nature of piety and or gendered spaces of pious practice. And then finally, whether the conceptualizing dawah as ritual ideology, how this is in relation to and or is not synonymous with the everyday, and how thinking about it as ritual ideology might invite us to revisit ritual in relation to ethics. And here I'm thinking about the distinction that Michael Lambeck makes between Rappaport's work on ritual and then his own shift into the realm of ethics. So, maybe reconceptualizing and teasing out the ritual versus the everyday, especially given the very marked spatial markers, right, in spaces of their Islamic practice and piety. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Attia. Arsalan?
Yes, thank you so much, Attia, for that. That was a very rich set of comments. I think I'll first I'll just start by saying I completely agree. I didn't really take this book to be, I say this a lot, some dramatic critique of existing literature. I actually felt like it was a framework that was able to bring together these two sides of a debate and try to hold them in some way in harmony while retaining the key insights. I say this, I think, in the introduction, while retaining the key insights of the piety literature about self-cultivation. So I'm not sure if I'm able to do that, but I certainly did not write the book as some radical rupture with the existing piety literature, but as a kind of extension of it, drawing on these, as you pointed out, these other theories, whether it be symbolic, semiotic stuff and ritual stuff, that I think, that's kind of what and to think about, I think about institutional forms and the way that those institutional forms are materialized in practices. And I think that is a contribution in the sense that, whether it be a bank or it be a dawat or it be some other, the way that those institutional forms then become emblematic of what religion is for the practitioners was, I think, a big question, important question that I was trying to address, right? So, and also not to set it up as just a kind of conflict between Islam and liberalism and Islam and secularism, which are, of course, also conflicts in the book, but to not set that up as the principal thing of critique, but instead to look at these kind of various forms trying to assert and constitute religion and thus claim sovereign authority. So I think that's where I think the intervention of the book is. And again, it is a book that draws on these other examples and tries to use, as you rightly pointed out, different theoretical tool sets that maybe somewhat awkwardly sit together. So I think I will go to just start with the issues, the questions raised of cultural intimacy. Yeah, I think that the way that I developed the idea of cultural intimacy in this is not similitude. That is to say, not that we're the same, obviously, as our interlocutors, but that there's some kind of common ground upon which that dialogue can unfold, and some imagination, I think is the way I put it, that we are interchangeable people, right? The presumption that we are interchangeable people. And then, of course, and I'm not the first to say this, in the question of native anthropology, that the fieldwork process and the approach of anthropology itself produces things at odds with the practices that we analyze. And so there's a tension that has to be mined and awkward. We have awkward relationship to our interlocutors, and we mine that kind of awkward intimacy. We're connected. Potentially they see us as one of them, but then we're doing practices like fieldwork that exceed or violate even the terms of the practice, their practice. And so I try to develop that. But I also use that as a vehicle I hope to talk about how that intimacy. I mean, we can think about the many strands of Islamic practices in Pakistan and Islamic movements as having that kind of not just Islamic but liberal as having that kind of intimacy with each other and that proximity with each other, which I think some claims about radical alterity, I'm thinking the ontological turn and these things, have erased or undermined. And I think that even the way that the anthropology of Islam has set up the tradition, Islamic tradition versus secularism, ends up in some way creating or reproducing that alterity. There's always something at odds. But in the Tablighi Jamaat, and those familiar with Pakistan will know this, I mean, I met Tablighis and they had, one of them was a leftist activist and Marxist, and another was a Tablighi, and the language that they spoke overlapped in ways, the work of dawat and the work of the activism of on the left. And so I think the cultural intimacy is a useful way to think about difference without radical rupture and the possibility of an interchangeability between these forms without losing sight of the differences. And so that's kind of, I think, why I used it. And there are lots of people that move in and out of the Tablighi Jamaat as well. And so they cease to be pietist of a certain kind. Many of them become liberal and, they become, or at least that, doctrinally they claim liberalism. And so I think that intimacy and that movement between these forms is something we should all be considering. Yeah. So that's how I thought about the framing of that. Competition, I think your point about competition is right. There are intersectional and interrelational processes that connect all kinds of movements. Again, brothers, one is in the Jamaat-e-Islami, the other is in the Tablighi Jamaat. They're brothers. They clearly share a great deal. And I think one pushback I've gotten, and I think it's reasonable, is that maybe I set up too much of a contrast between these types when really there's a considerable overlap between them. But I think they are competing forms in the sense that the hierarchy that one generates as the ranking of practices that one creates within a religion and the elevation of dawat over all these other things creates a kind of tension and a competition over bodies socially that I find very important, that these groups are actually in mosques, literally, and Navida's work is also touched on, Navida Khan's work is touched on. I mean, they're actually competing over space and bodies. So that's a competition, and that competition does get tense and it often gets violent in various ways. So that's, I guess, why I set up competition. Particular practices are like dawat are fields of value, and people are trying to materialize or realize that value, and that runs against other practices. And so they compete over people and compete over bodies, and the size and growing of the congregation is extremely important for Tablighis. So sorry, that's not a great answer to your question, but gendered nature, the Tablighi Jamaat is Deobandi. If you speak to lay Tablighis who are not that well-read, even they know Behishti Zevar, they know core tracks from the Deobandi tradition. That is the doctrinal center of the Tablighi Jamaat, and they have this respect, of course, for the ulama of the Tablighi Jamaat. But there is a bit of a tension between the Tablighis and the Deobandi ulama, the ones at least that don't privilege or prioritize dawat. So, the buzurgs of the Tablighi Jamaat have an independent autonomy and authority to the ulama who they respect, but they don't necessarily all work together on this. So the Deoband framework is the frame, but dawat as an institutional structure produces its own hierarchies and potentialities, and there are many alims I met, Deobandi alims, who were against tabligh. They didn't see tabligh in the form of the Tablighi Jamaat as actually being anything but an invention. So people have different stances on even within that doctrinal agreement on the form of the practice, its value, its necessity, and so on. Lots of Deobandi families that Tablighis are from, and one son is a Tablighi, but others don't like dawat, and there are tensions that arise within families over the valuation of each of these practices as the transcendent, right? As the means for the transcendent. Okay, the last thing I think you mentioned was the conceptualizing dawat as a ritual ideology as opposed to everyday. I think, and you mentioned Lambeck, and it's been a while since I've looked at that work, so I'm not going to reference it directly, but I think that one of the things I tried to do in chapter 5 with citationality, or chapter on the ethics of hierarchy is draw out that there are these formal ritualized practices, including the practices of listening. And then there are these more intimate, or intimate is probably not the word, but interactional discursive things that people do. You can do all of those formalized practices, but what Tablighis are gauging when they gauge piety is the translation of those formalized practices into these interactional relationships. And the interactional relationships, my point is that when I describe in the book Shah Zeib's struggle and his realization of the levels of authority between himself and others, I say he becomes a citational subject. He starts to recognize that authority, and unlike in many other movements, authority is not, you're not wearing a pin, or you don't have a special designation, right? Because anybody can become a tablighi, and most of them have done 4-month tours. The authority is almost this invisible thing that you have to learn. So it's a whole set of skills of being able to identify who is an authority, where the hierarchy is, what's the hierarchy, and how's my relationship to these people. And I use citation as a means to understand that. So the formal ritualized stuff, and things that would strike us as more everyday, like, which are still ritualized in a sense, but like recognizing other people's authority as being evidence for one's orientation towards God. So that's what I call the ethics of hierarchy. And so I think that to some extent I try to link the formal rituals with these discursive citational acts of piety, and and I think that's where the connection is for me between these things.
All right, thank you so much, Arsalan, and also Atiya, for your excellent questions. We are slightly over, and I too had questions of my own, some of which overlap with Shenila's and Atiya's, which I will probably ask at a different time. But thank you so much to the attendees and the panelists. And Navya will be in touch about the honorarium forms. And thanks so much for creating this, allowing us to host this discussion, and for giving us so much of your time today.
Thank you so much for organizing this, Faiza. Thank you so much, Kurt. Thank you, Atiya, for your rich comments. And Shenila is not here, but Shenila and everyone else that was involved in this. This was really a treat to be able to talk about my book.
Likewise to hear you. All right. See you all.
Okay.
Yes,
Thank you,
yes. No, thank you,
Congratulations.
Atiya. Thank you, Arsalan. Very nice to meet you. Thank you, Faisal, for moderating. Navya, can you please stop the recording?
Yes, got it.
But yes,